The grand ballroom was glowing that evening like it was made of gold and crystal. Soft lights hung from the high ceiling, reflecting off polished floors and tall mirrors along the walls. Music floated gently through the air from a live band placed near the stage. Guests in elegant dresses and expensive suits moved around with glasses in their hands, laughing, talking, and enjoying the night as if it had no end. It was one of those nights where everything looked perfect on the surface. But beneath the sparkle, there was something else too. An unspoken sense of pride among many of the guests. Most of them belonged to wealthy families or important social circles, and they carried themselves with confidence that often crossed into arrogance. Near the center of the ballroom stood a group of young guests who seemed to enjoy being watched. They laughed the loudest, spoke the most confidently, and often made remarks that drew attention from others. Among them was a young woman who had become the center of that group's energy. She had a bright smile, a sharp tongue, and a habit of speaking before thinking too deeply about her words. At one point during the evening, the music from the stage paused for a short break. The room grew slightly quieter, filled only with soft conversations and the clinking of glasses. It was during this pause that the young woman, feeling the attention of those around her, leaned slightly forward and made a playful but bold remark. She said that the night felt a little too ordinary and that someone should do something unforgettable. Then, with a light laugh, she added that if any man in the room could truly impress her with a piano performance, she might even consider marrying him. The words were spoken in a teasing tone, meant more as a joke than a real promise. Her friends burst into laughter immediately. The idea sounded ridiculous to them, and they repeated her words with playful exaggeration. A few nearby guests overheard and smiled, while others shook their heads in amusement. The comments spread quickly through the nearby tables, becoming part of the light entertainment of the evening. But not everyone reacted the same way. At the far edge of the ballroom, where the lighting was slightly dimmer and the noise was softer, a janitor quietly continued his work. He was responsible for keeping the hall clean and organized throughout the event. Most guests barely noticed him. To them, he was just part of the background, someone who came and went without being seen. He moved carefully between tables, collecting empty glasses and straightening chairs. His uniform was simple and he carried himself with quiet focus. Unlike the laughter and loud conversations around him, he remained silent, observing more than he spoke. When the young woman made her bold remark, it did not escape his ears. He had been nearby, wiping a table, and heard every word clearly. There was no reaction on his face, no sign of amusement or offense. He simply paused for a moment, then continued his work as if nothing had happened. Still, something about the atmosphere in the room began to shift slowly. As the evening went on, the guests returned to their conversations and drinks. The laughter around the young woman's comment gradually faded, replaced by other topics and distractions. But the idea lingered in the background, like a spark waiting for air. The janitor finished cleaning one section of the hall and moved toward another. As he worked, he occasionally glanced toward the grand piano placed on the raised stage. It was a beautiful instrument, black, polished, and clearly expensive. Even without touching it, it carried a presence in the room. Earlier in the night, a professional pianist had performed on it, filling the ballroom with elegant classical music. The performance had been well received, but something about it seemed incomplete. There had been moments where the melody felt like it wanted to go further, to express something deeper, but it stayed within safe limits. The janitor remembered those moments clearly. While others saw only entertainment, he seemed to notice structure, timing, and emotion in a different way. His eyes followed details that most people ignored, the way the pianist hesitated before certain transitions, the way the final notes softened too quickly, and the way the audience reacted more to showmanship than to depth. Still, he said nothing. As the night progressed, the ballroom grew even livelier. More guests arrived late, and the noise level increased again. The young woman and her group remained at the center of attention, continuing their playful conversations. Occasionally, someone would bring up her earlier comment, and each time it would lead to more laughter. It was all treated as a harmless joke, something meant to entertain rather than challenge anyone. But then something unexpected happened. The janitor, who had been working quietly near the side tables, finished his task and stood still for a moment. His gaze shifted once again toward the piano. This time it lingered longer than before. It was not the look of curiosity alone. It was something deeper, like recognition. He slowly removed his cleaning gloves and placed them neatly in his pocket. Then he took a few steps forward, moving away from the corner where he had been unnoticed for most of the evening. At first, no one paid attention. People were still engaged in their conversations, and the soft background music from the band covered the sound of his footsteps. But as he approached the stage, a few guests began to notice. A waiter paused mid-step. A couple of guests turned their heads slightly. The movement was subtle at first, like a small ripple in a calm lake. Then he stepped closer to the piano. A nearby guest whispered something, and another chuckled quietly, assuming it might be some sort of mistake or misunderstanding. The idea of a janitor approaching the grand piano did not seem serious to them. It felt out of place, almost amusing in itself. The young woman also noticed him at that moment. She tilted her head slightly, watching with mild curiosity mixed with amusement. For her, the earlier comment had already become a forgotten joke, something said in passing. She did not expect anything meaningful to come from it. But the janitor did not stop. He reached the edge of the stage and looked at the piano for a brief moment. The room around him was slowly beginning to quiet, not because anyone asked for silence, but because curiosity was spreading naturally. He placed one hand lightly on the edge of the piano bench. Then, without saying a word, he sat down. For a second, nothing happened. The ballroom seemed to hold its breath without realizing it. Conversations softened. Glasses paused mid-air. Even the laughter from the far tables faded slightly as attention began to shift toward the stage. The young woman's smile weakened just a little, though she still looked uncertain about what was about to happen. The janitor adjusted his position on the bench. His hands hovered above the keys, still not pressing anything. The silence in the room grew heavier, more focused. It was the kind of silence that did not feel empty but full of expectation. And in that moment, no one in the ballroom could have predicted that what would follow next would change the entire mood of the night. For a few long seconds, nothing happened. The entire ballroom seemed frozen in place, as if time itself had slowed down. The soft background noise that once filled the room had almost disappeared. Conversations had stopped halfway, and even the waiters stood still, unsure whether to continue working or watch what was about to unfold. The janitor sat quietly at the piano, his back straight, his hands hovering just above the keys. He did not look nervous. He did not look excited either. There was a calmness about him that felt out of place in such a tense moment. A few guests exchanged glances. Some raised their eyebrows, while others leaned closer to one another, whispering under their breath. To them, this moment felt strange, almost unreal. One guest near the front let out a quiet laugh, unable to hold it in. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to break the silence for a second. That small sound gave others permission to react again. A couple of people smiled, assuming this was some kind of joke or a bold attempt at attention. The young woman at the center of the earlier conversation crossed her arms lightly. There was still a hint of amusement on her face, but it had changed. It was no longer the carefree laughter from before. Now it carried curiosity, and maybe just a little bit of doubt. She hadn't expected anyone to take her words seriously, especially not someone like him. One of her friends leaned closer and whispered something that made her smirk again, but her eyes stayed fixed on the stage. There was something about the way the janitor sat there that didn't match the image they had of him. He wasn't fidgeting. He wasn't looking around for approval. He wasn't trying to entertain the crowd. He simply waited. The band members on the side of the stage also watched quietly. One of them shifted slightly, unsure whether to step in or let the situation continue. But something in the air told them to stay still. The janitor slowly lowered his hands. His fingers touched the keys very lightly at first, as if he was greeting them after a long time. There was no rush in his movement. Every small action felt controlled, careful, almost respectful. Then, finally, he pressed the first note. It was soft. So soft that, for a moment, some people thought they had imagined it. But then came another note, just as gentle, followed by a third. The sound was simple, almost too simple. It didn't carry the grand energy people expected from a performance in such a place. A few guests exchanged looks again, this time with faint smiles. It sounded basic to them, like something anyone could play. Someone near the back quietly said that it sounded like a beginner's tune. But the janitor did not react to any of it. He continued playing, letting the notes flow slowly, one after another. There was a steady rhythm, but it was unhurried. It felt like he was not trying to impress anyone. He was simply playing. The young woman tilted her head slightly. The smile on her face remained, but it had softened. She listened more carefully now, as if trying to understand what was happening. The melody continued in the same calm way for a little while longer. Then, without warning, something changed. The next set of notes came with a deeper tone. They carried more weight, more feeling. It was subtle at first, but it was there. The simple tune began to grow, slowly adding layers that hadn't been there before. The rhythm shifted slightly, becoming more fluid. The pauses between the notes felt more intentional. It was no longer just a series of sounds. It was beginning to feel like a story. The guests who had been smiling moments ago stopped. There was something unusual about the way the music was building. It didn't follow the predictable patterns they were used to hearing. Instead, it moved in a way that felt natural, like a quiet conversation turning into something meaningful. The janitor's hands moved more freely now. His fingers traveled across the keys with growing confidence, but still without any showy gestures. There was no attempt to draw attention to himself. All the attention was being drawn to the music instead. A couple sitting near the stage leaned forward slightly, their expressions changing from amusement to interest. One of the band members lowered his instrument slowly, watching more closely now. The young woman uncrossed her arms. Her expression shifted again. The playful look in her eyes began to fade, replaced by something more serious. She wasn't smiling anymore. The melody deepened. It carried a quiet emotion that was hard to explain. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it had a way of reaching into the room and holding people still. It felt personal, like something that didn't belong to the crowd, but was being shared with them anyway. The whispers stopped completely. Even the guests who had been distracted before now found themselves looking toward the stage. There was no clear reason why, but the music was pulling them in. The janitor's posture remained steady. His face showed very little expression, but there was a focus in his eyes that hadn't been there before. It was as if the rest of the room had disappeared for him. The notes began to connect more smoothly, forming a melody that felt complete. What had started as something simple was now turning into something layered and rich. A soft harmony joined in, created by his other hand. It added depth, making the music feel fuller. The balance between the hands was natural, almost effortless. Someone near the middle of the room slowly put down their glass on the table without taking their eyes off the stage. Another guest, who had been checking their phone, slipped it back into their pocket. The atmosphere in the ballroom had changed completely. It was no longer a place of noise and laughter. It had become quiet, focused, almost thoughtful. The young woman took a small step forward without realizing it. Her attention was fully on the piano now. There was no trace of mockery left in her expression. Instead, there was something else, something closer to realization. The janitor continued playing, letting the music grow naturally. He did not rush into anything complex. He allowed each part to build on the last, creating a sense of movement that felt real and honest. The melody rose slightly, carrying a gentle intensity. It was not overwhelming, but it was enough to make people feel something they hadn't expected when the night began. A quiet emotion spread through the room. Some guests felt it as calm. Others felt it as nostalgia. A few simply couldn't explain it, but they knew it was there. The earlier laughter now felt distant, almost out of place. The janitor's hands moved with more confidence now, but still without showing off. There was control in every note, a clear understanding of where the music was going. The young woman slowly lowered her gaze for a moment, then looked back at him again. It was as if she was trying to understand how she had misjudged this person so quickly. Around her, her friends had gone silent too. No one whispered. No one laughed. They simply listened. And as the melody continued to unfold, it became clear to everyone in that room that this was not just a simple performance. Something unexpected had begun. And it was only just getting started. The melody did not stop, continued to grow, slowly pulling everyone deeper into its rhythm. What had started as something soft and simple was now becoming fuller, richer, and impossible to ignore. The janitor's fingers moved across the keys with quiet confidence. There was no tension in his shoulders, no rush in his hands. He played like someone who understood every note before it was even heard. The room stayed completely still. Even the air felt different now, heavier but calm at the same time. It was as if the music had taken control of the space, gently asking everyone to listen, and no one dared to refuse. The young woman stood near the front, her eyes fixed on the stage. She no longer looked like the person who had laughed earlier. Her posture had changed. Her expression had softened into something more thoughtful, almost uncertain. Her friends beside her were just as quiet. One of them slowly leaned closer, as if wanting to say something, but then stopped. There were no words that felt right in that moment. The music shifted again. This time it became slightly faster, not in a rushed way, but with purpose. The melody rose and fell, creating a pattern that felt alive. It carried emotion in a way that was hard to explain, like a memory that didn't belong to anyone but somehow felt familiar to everyone. A man near the back of the room, who had been checking his watch earlier, now stood still with his arms relaxed at his sides. His attention was completely captured. A server holding a tray paused near a table, forgetting for a moment what he was supposed to do. His eyes were on the stage just like everyone else. The janitor's hands moved further across the piano now. His left hand created a steady bass, while his right hand danced lightly above it, adding layers of sound that felt both gentle and powerful at the same time. There was no doubt anymore. This was not luck. This was not something simple. This was skill. Real skill. The young woman took another small step forward. She didn't even notice that she was moving closer. It happened naturally, like her body was following the music without asking her permission. Her breathing slowed. Her thoughts, which had been full of confidence and amusement earlier, were now quiet. She watched his hands carefully, as if trying to understand how someone she had completely overlooked could create something like this. The music continued to build. A deeper tone entered the melody, adding weight to it. Felt stronger now, more emotional. It wasn't loud, but it carried a kind of quiet strength that filled the entire room. A couple sitting near the stage exchanged a quick glance. One of them gave a small nod, as if silently admitting that they were witnessing something special. The band members stood still, their earlier uncertainty replaced with respect. One of them slowly sat down, listening closely, as if learning something just by watching. The janitor did not look at the crowd. His eyes stayed on the keys, focused and calm. It was clear that he was not playing for attention. He was playing because the music needed to be played. And somehow that made it even more powerful. The young woman felt something shift inside her. It was not sudden, but it was real. The laughter from earlier replayed in her mind for a brief moment, but it felt distant now, almost embarrassing. She remembered the exact words she had said, the way she had laughed, the way others had followed her lead. At the time, it had felt harmless. Now it didn't. Her gaze dropped slightly, then lifted again toward the stage. There was a new feeling in her eyes, something softer, more aware. The melody reached a turning point. The notes became quicker, more connected, flowing into each other with a smooth energy that made it impossible to look away. It felt like the music was telling a story, one that didn't need words to be understood. Some guests leaned forward in their seats. Others stood completely still, afraid that even the smallest movement might break the moment. The janitor's hands moved with greater confidence now. His fingers pressed the keys with perfect timing, creating a sound that felt full and complete. There was no hesitation, no mistake, just music. A quiet emotion spread through the room again, stronger this time. Some people felt it as a sense of wonder. Others felt it as something deeper, something personal they couldn't fully explain. The young woman pressed her lips together gently. Her expression had changed completely. There was no trace of mockery left. Instead, there was a growing understanding that she had been wrong. Very wrong. The music softened suddenly. The shift was gentle but noticeable. The faster notes slowed down, returning to a calmer pace. It felt like a moment of reflection, like the music was taking a breath after saying something important. The room followed that change. People relaxed slightly, but their attention did not fade. If anything, they were even more focused now. The janitor's hands moved more slowly again, but every note carried meaning. It wasn't about speed or complexity anymore. It was about feeling. The young woman's eyes stayed locked on him. She noticed things she hadn't seen before. The way his posture remained steady. The way his hands moved without tension. The way he seemed completely connected to what he was playing. It didn't match the image she had created of him in her mind. Not at all. A soft whisper started somewhere in the room, then quickly faded. No one wanted to interrupt the moment. The music rose again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't trying to impress. It wasn't trying to prove anything. It simply existed, honest and real. And that honesty reached people in a way that no loud performance could. The young woman slowly took another step forward, now standing closer to the stage than before. She didn't look around at her friends anymore. She didn't care about their reactions. For the first time that night, her attention was not on being seen. It was on seeing. The janitor continued, his movements smooth and controlled. The melody carried a quiet confidence now, as if it knew exactly where it was going. And everyone followed. The earlier noise, the laughter, the pride. It all felt like it belonged to a different night. This moment was something else entirely. As the music flowed through the room, one thing became clear to everyone present. This was no ordinary performance. And the person they had barely noticed before was no ordinary man. The music continued, but something about it began to change again. It was no longer just beautiful. It was becoming powerful. The janitor's hands moved with more strength now, pressing the keys with deeper emotion. The soft melody that had once felt calm and gentle slowly transformed into something bold and alive. Each note carried weight like it meant something important. The room could feel it. People who had been standing relaxed before now straightened slightly. A few took a quiet step closer to the stage without even thinking about it. It was as if the music was pulling them forward, inviting them to come closer. The young woman stood just a few steps away from the piano now. Her eyes followed every movement of his hands. There was no distraction left in her mind. No pride, no jokes, no desire to impress anyone. Only attention. The sound filled every corner of the ballroom. It echoed softly off the walls and blended with the quiet air, creating something that felt almost unreal. The janitor's left hand moved firmly, creating a steady rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. His right hand moved faster, weaving a melody above it that felt emotional and alive. The two worked together perfectly like they had done this many times before. And that's when people began to truly understand. This was not just skill. This was experience. There was a story in the way he played, a depth that could not come from practice alone. It felt like every note carried a memory. Something lived, something felt deeply. A man near the front slowly shook his head in disbelief, a small smile forming as he listened. A woman beside him placed her hand over her heart without realizing it, as if the music had reached somewhere personal. The young woman felt it too. Her chest felt tight, not in a painful way, but in a way that made her aware of every note. She didn't understand why, but the music made her feel something she hadn't expected to feel that night. Regret. Not just for what she said earlier, but for how easily she had judged someone she didn't even know. Her eyes dropped for a second, then lifted again quickly, as if she didn't want to miss even a single moment of what was happening. The janitor leaned slightly into the piano, still focused, still calm, but now fully connected to the music. His movements were stronger, more expressive. The melody rose higher, reaching a peak that made the entire room feel full. No one moved, Even the smallest sound, like a glass being placed on a table, would have felt too loud now. The silence of the audience became part of the performance itself. Then suddenly the music shifted again. It became faster. Not in a chaotic way, but in a way that showed control. His fingers moved quickly across the keys, but every note was clear. There was no confusion, no mistake. Just precision. A quiet gasp escaped from someone near the stage. Another person whispered, "How is he doing that?" But the whisper faded quickly, swallowed by the sound of the piano. The janitor's hands crossed over each other for a brief moment, then returned to their places with smooth ease. It was a small movement, but it showed something more, confidence that came from deep understanding. The young woman noticed it. Her eyes widened slightly, not in shock, but in realization. She was beginning to see the truth clearly now. This man had not just learned music. He had lived it. The melody continued to climb, building tension in the most natural way. It felt like something important was coming, something that would change everything. The guests leaned in almost as one. The janitor's expression remained calm, but there was a quiet intensity in his eyes now. It wasn't for the audience. It was for the music itself. The sound grew fuller, stronger, filling every space in the room. And then, he slowed down. Just like that, the fast notes faded into something softer again. The sudden change caught everyone off guard, but it didn't break the moment. Instead, it deepened it. It felt like a pause in a story, a moment to breathe after something powerful. The young woman let out a slow breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Her thoughts were no longer scattered. Everything felt clear now, focused on the man sitting at the piano. The janitor's hands moved gently again, creating a soft melody that felt almost fragile. It was simple but not empty, carried meaning, like a quiet conversation after a storm. Some guests lowered their heads slightly, listening with full attention. The room felt smaller now, more intimate, even though it was filled with people. The young woman took one more step forward. Now she stood very close to the stage, close enough to see every detail clearly. She could see the slight movement of his fingers, the calm rhythm of his breathing, the focus in his eyes. She realized something in that moment. He had not once looked at the audience. Not once. He wasn't playing for applause. He wasn't playing to prove anything. He was playing because it mattered to him. That realization hit her harder than anything else. Because everything she had done earlier, every word, every laugh, had been about being seen. And here he was showing her something completely different. The music began to rise again, slowly this time. It wasn't as intense as before, but it carried a quiet strength. It felt like the final part of something important, like the closing of a chapter. The janitor's hands moved with perfect balance, bringing together everything he had played so far. The soft notes, the strong ones, the fast parts, the slow moments, they all came together in a way that felt complete. The guests felt it. No one needed to say anything. The understanding was shared. This was not just a performance anymore. It was something unforgettable. The young woman's eyes softened. There was no pride left in her expression. No trace of the person who had laughed earlier. Only respect. And something deeper. The final notes began to approach. The melody slowed, each note spaced carefully, as if the music itself didn't want to end too quickly. The janitor pressed the keys gently, letting each sound fade naturally before moving to the next. The room held its breath again, and in those final moments, everyone knew that something had changed. Not just in the room, but in the way they saw the man sitting at that piano, and especially in the way one person saw herself. The final notes had not yet faded, but the entire room already felt different. It was as if something invisible had passed through everyone at the same time. The air felt heavier, not in a bad way, but in a way that made people more aware of their thoughts, their feelings, and the moment they were standing in. The janitor's fingers slowed down even more, pressing each key with care, allowing the sound to breathe before moving to the next. It felt like he was gently bringing the music to a close, not rushing it, not forcing it, just letting it end the way it was meant to. The young woman stood still, her eyes fixed on his hands. She didn't blink much anymore. Her thoughts had quieted, but inside, something was shifting. The confidence she had carried earlier in the evening now felt distant, almost like it belonged to someone else. In its place was a quiet awareness, something softer, something more real. The melody softened again, almost like a whisper. The notes were light, spaced apart, and filled with emotion. They didn't need to be loud to be heard. Every person in the room was already listening with full attention. A man near the back slowly sat down, even though there were no empty chairs left nearby. He simply lowered himself onto the edge of a table, unable to take his eyes off the stage. A woman standing near the side pressed her lips together, her expression thoughtful, as if the music had reminded her of something personal. No one spoke. No one moved. The janitor's hands began to slow further, approaching the final part of the piece. The melody repeated gently, like it was saying goodbye in its own quiet way. Then, with one last smooth movement, he pressed the final key. The sound lingered in the air for a moment, then faded. Silence followed. Not the kind of silence that feels empty, but the kind that feels full of meaning, full of emotion, full of everything that had just been experienced. No one clapped. Not yet. It was as if the room needed time to understand what had just happened. The janitor kept his hands resting lightly on the keys for a second longer. Then he slowly lifted them and placed them on his lap. His posture remained calm, unchanged, as if he had simply finished something ordinary. But everyone else knew it wasn't ordinary. The young woman took a small breath, her chest rising slowly. She looked around for a brief moment. The people who had laughed earlier were now silent. The same faces that had once carried amusement now held something else. Respect, surprise, even a little disbelief. One of her friends lowered their gaze, clearly uncomfortable with the memory of how they had reacted before. Another looked toward the floor, shaking their heads slightly, as if trying to process what they had just witnessed. The young woman turned her attention back to the stage. The janitor was still sitting there, not looking at anyone, not waiting for a reaction. There was no expectation in his body language, no need for approval. That, more than anything, made the moment even more powerful. Finally, someone near the front began to clap. It was a single, soft clap at first. Then another joined, and another. Within seconds, the entire room filled with applause. It wasn't loud in a chaotic way. It was strong, steady, and real. Every clap carried meaning, as if people were not just applauding the performance, but acknowledging something deeper. The janitor stood up slowly. He didn't rush. He didn't bow dramatically. He simply turned slightly toward the audience and gave a small, respectful nod. The applause grew louder. A few people even stood up, not because they were told to, but because it felt right. The young woman felt her hands moving before she even realized it. She was clapping too, not out of habit, not to follow others, but because she meant it. Her eyes remained on him as he stepped away from the piano, and for the first time he looked up. His gaze moved across the room briefly, not searching for attention, but simply acknowledging the people in front of him. For a split second, his eyes met hers. It wasn't a long moment, but it was enough. She felt it. There was no judgment in his eyes, no pride, no anger, just calm. That made it even harder for her, because she knew how she had acted earlier. And yet, he showed no sign of holding it against her. The applause slowly began to settle. People started to murmur again, but their voices were quieter now, more thoughtful. Small conversations began to form. Who is he? Where did he learn to play like that? Why is he working here? Questions spread through the room, one after another. But no one had answers. The janitor stepped down from the stage and began walking back toward the side of the hall. Not toward the center, not toward the crowd, but back to where he had been before, as if nothing had changed. The young woman watched him carefully. Something inside her told her not to let this moment pass. Not like this. Her feet moved before her mind could fully catch up. She stepped forward, leaving her group behind, her focus only on him now. The distance between them grew smaller with each step. He reached the edge of the ballroom and picked up his cleaning gloves again, just as he had left them. The contrast felt almost unreal. Moments ago, he had filled the entire room with something unforgettable. And now he stood there quietly, ready to return to his work. The young woman stopped a few steps away from him. For a moment, she said nothing. She wasn't sure what to say. The words she had spoken earlier felt heavy in her memory. They echoed in her mind, making it harder to find new ones. He didn't look up right away. He simply continued what he was doing, calm and steady. She took a small breath. "I didn't know," she began, but her voice faded before she could finish. It sounded weak, uncertain, not like her usual tone at all. He paused for a moment, then looked up at her. His expression remained neutral, but not cold. Just quiet. She tried again. I didn't expect." Again, the words didn't feel right, because the truth was simple. She hadn't expected anything from him at all. And that was the problem. She lowered her gaze for a second, then looked back at him. This time, her voice was softer, more honest. "That was really beautiful." It wasn't a grand apology. It wasn't a perfect sentence. But it was real. He nodded slightly. "Thank you," he said calmly. Nothing more. No long explanation. No attempt to make the moment bigger than it needed to be. Just simple words. And somehow that made them feel even more meaningful. She stood there for a second longer, unsure of what to do next. Around them, the room was slowly returning to normal. Conversations picked up again, but the energy was different now. Quieter, more thoughtful. The young woman realized something in that moment. The night had not changed because of a joke. It had changed because of him. And more importantly, it had changed something inside her. She didn't fully understand it yet, but she knew it was there, and it wasn't going away. The room slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but nothing felt the same anymore. Conversation started again, glasses clinked softly, and the band prepared to continue their music. But there was a clear difference in the way people spoke and moved. The loud confidence from earlier had softened. The laughter was quieter now, more controlled, as if everyone was still thinking about what had just happened. The young woman stood still for a moment longer, watching the janitor as he calmly returned to his work. He moved just like before, quiet, focused, and unnoticed by most. But now she saw him differently, not just as someone in the background, but as someone who carried something rare. She slowly stepped back, giving him space, but her eyes didn't leave him. Her friends called out to her from behind, asking where she had gone. Their voices were lighter now, less bold than before. She turned and walked back toward them. They looked at her with curious expressions, waiting for her to say something. One of them smiled awkwardly, trying to bring back the playful mood. "That was unexpected," someone said softly. Another gave a small laugh, but it didn't carry the same confidence as before. Who would have thought?" The young woman didn't laugh. She looked at them, then glanced back toward the corner where the janitor was working. "I shouldn't have said that earlier," she said quietly. Her friends fell silent. They weren't used to hearing her speak like that. She was usually the one leading the jokes, not stepping away from them. "It was just a joke," one of them replied, trying to ease the moment, but she shook her head gently. "It didn't feel like a joke," she said. There was no anger in her voice, just honesty. Her friends exchanged glances, unsure how to respond. Some of them looked down, thinking about their own reactions earlier. The young woman took a slow breath. For the first time that night, she didn't feel the need to impress anyone. She didn't feel the need to lead the conversation or be the center of attention. She simply stood there, present in the moment. The band began to play again, filling the room with soft background music. It was pleasant, but it didn't carry the same depth as what had been played earlier. People listened, but their attention wasn't as focused. Something had changed. Across the room, small groups continued to talk about the performance. Some tried to guess who the janitor really was. Others wondered why someone with that kind of talent would choose such a quiet life. But no one approached him again. There was a new kind of respect now, one that kept people from disturbing him. The young woman listened to these conversations for a while, but she didn't join them. Instead, she found herself thinking about how quickly she had judged him, thinking about how easily she had laughed, thinking about how wrong she had been. After a few minutes, she quietly stepped away from her group again. This time, she didn't hesitate. She walked toward the side of the ballroom where the janitor was working. He was wiping down a table, just as he had been earlier. His movements were steady and calm, as if nothing unusual had happened. She stopped a few steps away from him. For a moment, she simply watched. Then she spoke. "Can I ask you something?" He looked up at her, his expression the same as before. Calm, open, but not overly expressive. "Yes," he replied. She hesitated for a second, choosing her words carefully. "Why didn't you say anything earlier?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he placed the cloth down on the table and straightened slightly. "There was nothing to say," he said. She frowned slightly, not fully understanding. "You heard what I said," she replied. "Everyone heard it." He nodded once. "Yes. And still, you didn't react." He looked at her for a moment, then spoke in the same calm tone. "Not everything needs a reaction." His words were simple, but they stayed with her. She looked down for a second, then back at him. "I didn't mean it," she said. "At least, not in a serious way." "I know," he replied. That surprised her. "You do." He gave a small nod. "People say things when they want attention," he said. "It happens." There was no judgment in his voice, no blame, just understanding. And somehow that made her feel even more aware of her mistake. She crossed her arms lightly, but not in a defensive way. It was more like she was holding herself steady. "I've never seen anything like that before," she admitted. "The way you played, it didn't feel like a performance." He gave a small, thoughtful look, as if considering her words. "It wasn't," he said. She tilted her head slightly. "Then what was it?" He picked up the cloth again, but didn't start cleaning yet. "Just something I've carried for a long time," he said. She didn't fully understand what he meant, but she didn't press further. Instead, she nodded slowly. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It felt natural. Around them, the party continued, but it felt distant now. The young woman looked at the piano again, then back at him. "You could be up there," she said. "On stages, in big places, people would listen." He gave a faint smile. "People listen tonight," he replied. She couldn't argue with that. For a moment, she just stood there, thinking. Then she smiled slightly, not the confident smile from earlier, but something softer. "I guess they did." He returned to his work, gently wiping the table. She didn't leave right away. Instead, she stayed there, watching him for a few more seconds. Then she spoke again, her voice quiet but clear. "Thank you." He looked up briefly. "For what?" he asked. "For showing me something I didn't see before." He didn't respond with words this time. He just nodded once. And that was enough. She turned and walked back toward the center of the room. But her steps were different now. Slower, more thoughtful. The night continued, but for her, it had already reached its most important moment. The music, the laughter, the lights, they all faded into the background. What stayed was the lesson, a simple one. That talent doesn't always stand where people expect it to. That respect shouldn't depend on appearance. And that sometimes the quietest person in the room has the strongest voice, if only given the chance to be heard. As the evening slowly came to an end, guests began to leave one by one. The lights dimmed slightly, and the energy of the ballroom softened. The young woman paused near the exit and looked back one last time. The janitor was still there, finishing his work, just as quietly as he had started. But now she knew. He wasn't just part of the background. He never was. And with that thought, she stepped out into the night, carrying something new with her. Something far more valuable than the evening she had expected. Something she would not forget.